Hello, and welcome to Informed in 30, a new series from the National Brain Tumor Society designed to give you, our patients and caregivers, everything you need to know about cutting-edge advancements in brain tumor research and treatment. Our topic today is innovations in immunotherapy. My name is Rachael Kittleson, and I'm the Director of Community Relations at the National Brain Tumor Society, and I oversee our Connections program, which provides support and assistance to patients while advancing care and connection for the entire brain tumor community. I also represent the community as a former caregiver to my daughter, who passed away from glioblastoma in 2017. Joining us today is Dr. Kirk Tanner, National Brain Tumor Society's Chief Scientific Officer, and Dr. Duane Mitchell, Assistant Vice President for Research at University of Florida, Director of the University of Florida Clinical and Translational Science Institute, and co-director of the Wells Brain Tumor Center at UF Health. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Rachael. It's great to be a part of this Informed in 30 series, which brings cutting-edge and timely information to our brain tumor community. Today, we're very fortunate to be joined by an outstanding leader in brain tumor immunotherapy, Dr. Duane Mitchell, a physician scientist who is at the forefront of research, translation, and patient care.
Well, thank you, Rachael and Kirk, for this invitation. It's really a pleasure to be a part of this forum and to share updates on the advancements of immunotherapy, in particular its applications for treatment of patients with malignant brain tumors.
Excellent. Okay, so great. So without any further ado then, Dr. Mitchell, can you give us an overview of what is immunotherapy, its potential, and how it's currently being used and evaluated for brain tumor patients?
Absolutely. And it's a pleasure to go through a little bit of background on the field and current approaches that are being advanced for the treatment of malignant brain tumors. We can bring up our slides. I have a few slides I'll go through to cover the background and future directions in immunotherapy treatment. All right. So these are my relevant disclosures. I do have some technologies patented in the immunotherapy space, and I'm the founder of a company that is advancing cancer immunotherapy treatments, but that will not be the subject of our discussions today. So since 2013, when Science declared in their December issue of Science magazine the breakthrough of the year being cancer immunotherapy, we've really seen a revolution of the application of using the immune system to treat advanced and refractory cancers. In just those last 8 years, we've seen a number of indications now FDA approved for the use of cancer immunotherapy treatments, either as frontline or secondary treatment approaches for a variety of patients with cancer. You can see on this list, updated just about a month ago, there's over 18 different cancers or cancer types that have now had an FDA approval using cancer immunotherapy treatments. And this really highlights a field that for many decades had been an aspirational hope that we could harness the power of the immune system to treat advanced cancers, to now being an integrated mainstream pillar in the treatment of malignancies. Of course, missing from this list are many cancers, and of course, those that are really important to the community we're addressing today. And those are patients with primary malignant brain tumors. And so one of the things we'll discuss is how does cancer immunotherapy work, being evaluated, and its relevance for brain tumors, and some of the challenges that we face in bringing this very powerful modality for treating cancer into the battle effectively for patients with malignant brain tumors. If we look at the major approaches that are being used in brain tumor immunotherapy, at least with respect to those that have reached FDA approval for treatments in other cancers, we really have four main categories or approaches in tackling the immune system currently. The longest standing history has been the development of cancer vaccines, where we try to stimulate a patient's own immune response, either against proteins called antigens that are expressed within their tumor cells, or even using the tumor cells of the patient themselves as a formulation that can be modified in a way that it is more immunogenic to the immune system, and then re-administered back to patients with the hope that we can stimulate a very potent and sustained immune response that can now attack those cancer cells. Cancer vaccines have reached FDA approval for the treatment of prostate cancer and also an indication in melanoma that has shown efficacy in late-stage trials, but still have not really become a mainstream form of treatment for the majority of malignancies that have cancer immunotherapy approvals. The second category of treatment, adoptive cellular therapy, really involves harnessing the immune effector cells from a patient and expanding them to very large numbers, while also either modifying them or stimulating those effector cells so that they recognize the patient's own cancer and can kill them effectively. This can be done through genetic engineering approaches. Many may have heard of something called CAR T cells, or chimeric antigen receptor T cells. These are T cells of the immune system that have been modified now to recognize a patient's own cancer and have been extraordinarily effective in the treatment of hematologic malignancies such as leukemia and some lymphomas. The third category in the lower left corner of the slide, immune checkpoint inhibitors, have really revolutionized the treatment of the largest number of cancers to date. And these are drugs that actually block some of the inhibitory signals that the immune system has in order to keep immune responses regulated and in check. This is important for normal function of the immune system. We don't want immune reactions to go unchecked or prolonged. But in many patients with cancer, these immune checkpoints, as they're called, are upregulated in such that the stop signal for the immune response is on all of the time, preventing the patient's own immune system from recognizing and attacking their cancer cells. Immune checkpoint inhibitors are typically antibodies that now block these stop signals and allow the immune system to proceed in a much more rigorous fashion against those tumor antigens. And this has really been profoundly effective in a large number of cancers. And we'll talk a little bit about why we've seen this modality to be so effective in some tumors and are yet still looking for how to harness the power of these immune checkpoint regulators in the treatment of brain tumors. And then oncolytic viruses are actually viruses that have been modified to preferentially replicate and kill tumor cells as opposed to normal cells. And it has been found that in the process of infecting tumor cells and then killing them, this can awaken an immune response, not just against the virus, but actually have an immunity against the tumor be induced in that fashion. And this has been an effective treatment and an FDA approval for patients with metastatic melanoma, and is being actively explored as a treatment modality for a number of other cancers, including brain tumors. So who benefits from these immunotherapy treatments? One of the things that we've seen is, while I showed you that long list of cancers that have FDA approvals, not all patients, however, that receive cancer immunotherapy treatments, even for those indications where they've had FDA approval, do see a benefit from the treatment. In fact, generally speaking, we see about a third of the patients who are treated with immunotherapy treatment regimens to date currently showing durable and measurable treatment benefits. This oversimplified curve somewhat demonstrates visually what the impact really has been in over standard therapy for the treatment of many cancers. If you look at the white line and the treatment of advanced malignancies, what we have seen with standard treatments such as surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy is oftentimes the ability to prolong survival in advanced cancer settings, but very, very few patients that we've been able to achieve durable remissions or cures. What we have seen, and generally with immunotherapy treatments, is that there is a subset, a significant fraction of patients, and I mentioned roughly around a third of patients taken collectively, that really seem to demonstrate these durable and lasting benefits from immune therapy. But there are still many patients, as you can see in this curve, that are treated with immunotherapy and visually represented as not yet receiving benefit. And so one of the big efforts in the field, not just for patients with brain tumors, but for even those malignancies that we've seen effective immunotherapy treatments, is to try to understand what are the characteristics of the patients that comprise this tail, if you will, of long-term survival and benefit compared to those that receive treatment and don't seem to have these durable benefits. This is important for us in terms of advancing our understanding and how we may leverage these therapies for patients with malignant brain tumors. One of the central concepts that has really come out of studying the responses of immunotherapy in a variety of patient populations is this concept of hot versus cold tumors. And this is a simplification of describing the baseline characteristics of a cancer that determines whether it's more likely to respond to immunotherapy or not. Hot tumors, if you will, or those that are likely to respond, tend to be characterized by having a large number of mutations And these mutations alter the proteins in the cancer so that they can be recognized by the immune system. And these new antigens are called neoantigens that come from these mutations. The presence of immune cells already in the tumor, indicating that the patient's immune system is attempting to attack cancer cells, tends to be a baseline indicator that with the appropriate treatment, this already activated immune response can be taken advantage of to have a more effective treatment effect against tumor cells. And also the expression of certain immune markers within the tumor, such as a ligand called PD-L1. This can be more predictive of responding to certain treatments like a PD-1 inhibitor. This ligand actually is important for one of those important checkpoint pathways. And if you treat patients that overexpress this marker with checkpoint inhibitors blocking the PD-L1 pathway, they are more likely to respond to this type of treatment. Unfortunately, we know that from the examination of patients with malignant brain tumors, they fall more into this category of cold tumors that tend to have less mutations or neoantigens, a paucity of immune cells that are capable of attacking the tumor, at least present at baseline, and a variable expression of these immune checkpoint markers. And so one of the active areas of exploration within patients with brain tumors is how can we either stimulate an immune response through active strategies like vaccines or adoptive T-cell therapy, and or understand the regulatory pathways that may be most important in those brain tumors, in addition to the PD-1 pathway that may be more effective at awakening a host immune response. Some of the challenges that we face is addressing the pathways of immunosuppression. The fact that brain tumors are heterogeneous, or meaning they're different, not just from patient to patient, but even within a given tumor, we know that the cells express a variety of different proteins, antigens, and regulatory pathways that have to be addressed. Our understanding of how the immune system really engages the central nervous system is incomplete. And so therefore, the strategies that may stimulate an immune response in the periphery may not be as effective at sustaining those responses in the central nervous system. And the effects of standard therapy are really an important component that we have to understand how best to integrate immunotherapeutic approaches and potentially sequence them or time them in a way that may be more effective. Surgery, which we know is one of the mainstays in frontline treatment of malignant brain tumors, there's interesting studies that we may talk more about that shows the timing of immunotherapy, perhaps in conjunction with surgery or prior to surgical resection, may be important for stimulating a better immune response. And obviously radiation, chemotherapy, tumor treating fields, and even laser ablative therapies that are used in some treatment of some brain tumor patients all have effects on the immune microenvironment, and we don't fully appreciate or understand both the immediate and long-term effects of these treatments and how they affect the local and systemic immune response. These are areas of active study in our laboratories and many others, where there's at least demonstrable benefits to understanding when and what type of immunotherapy to either integrate or sequence with these standard treatments. That said, there are still demonstrable examples of patients with malignant brain tumors that do respond effectively to immunotherapy. This is a MRI of a patient who was treated on a clinical trial at our center using dendritic cell vaccines, showing an incomplete resection in the left with the red arrows pointing to 2 areas of glioblastoma growth that could not be removed by surgery. This patient has had a durable and complete response to treatment after 5 cycles of both dendritic cell-based vaccines and temozolomide that's now been durable for over 3 years. We also know that immunotherapy treatments can have a profile of side effects. And so the safety profile of different forms of immune treatment are really important to address and to understand for those who are considering receiving immunotherapy treatment either in standard or experimental clinical trial settings. Generally speaking, immunotherapy has been well tolerated by patients who are treated, but the different types of modalities, when we talk about vaccines, checkpoint inhibitors, T-cell therapies, or oncolytic viruses, each can have distinctive side effect profiles and percentages of patients who experience those effects. Some of the more common immune adverse events are seen with immune checkpoint inhibitors or adoptive T-cell therapies. And this diagram just shows that there are a variety of system organs that can be impacted by immunotherapy treatment. And it is very important that the providers that are administering these treatments monitor patients, and patients and their families also monitor for side effects and report them very quickly to their physicians if they are receiving immunotherapeutic treatment. What we've learned is that with close and active management, these side effects usually can be managed well. But if unchecked or if not addressed early on, they can manifest as significant and even fatal toxicities. So what does the future look like for advancement of immunotherapy for brain tumors? What we're focused on, and I think many in the field, is moving from generalized approaches to more personalized approaches for immunotherapy treatment. In other words, trying to identify the right patient for the right treatment modality based on our understanding of who's more likely to respond to a particular type of immunotherapy. One of the approaches that we're looking at is using the genomic sequencing and analysis of expression of proteins within a patient's own tumor cell to actually take RNA and DNA sequencing using computer algorithms and the characteristics of that patient's own immune response to really predict what are the best targets for the immune system within that patient's particular cancer, and then making a patient-specific vaccine or adoptive T-cell therapy that is actually tailored to the individual patient. This is one example of a precision immunotherapy approach that we are pursuing in our center, and many other centers are using similar approaches to try to profile patients' tumors and deliver the immunotherapy treatments that perhaps have best likelihood for benefit. This graph really shows the aspirational goals then of using these personalized treatment approaches, where with standard treatments, we've now moved into an era where immunotherapy can provide durable benefit, but not to the majority of patients yet treated with immune therapy. We hope with personalized and better understanding of the baseline characteristics and response characteristics, we can start to select the appropriate combinations for patients to be treated and really move these survival benefits and durable benefit curves further and further north and further to the right in terms of the percentage of patients and the duration of those treatment responses. I'd just like to thank the members of our immunotherapy program who've contributed to the ongoing studies at our center, of course, to patients and their families and the funders that continue to support this research, and obviously to the National Brain Tumor Society for the opportunity to share this update.
Dr. Mitchell, thank you so much for such a great overview and presentation. I'll hand it back to Rachael for questions from the community in a minute. But first, I wanted to give a quick overview of how National Brain Tumor Society is involved in research and then really translating that research to the clinic for immunotherapies for brain tumor patients. National Brain Tumor Society funds translational research to bring forward promising new immunotherapies so that they can be tested and evaluated in brain tumor patients. These type of immunotherapies include many that Dr. Mitchell just described, including viruses, vaccines, antibodies, CAR-Ts, small molecules. And they're all aimed at stimulating the patient's own immune system to detect, engage, with the ultimate goal of effectively eradicating the tumor. National Brain Tumor Society is also committed to bringing together all the stakeholders that are required to figure out how to best harness these immunotherapies for brain tumor patients. A couple examples of this is our research roundtable program that has brought together experts like Dr. Mitchell and other scientific and medical leaders with regulators from the FDA, pharma and biotech companies, and really importantly, patients, to try to understand and break down what are the key barriers for developing new treatments, new drugs, new immunotherapies for patients. We've also recently joined forces with the Parker Institute for Cancer Immunotherapy to hold a successful workshop exploring the challenges and the opportunities for immunotherapy in brain tumors. So these are just a few examples of how National Brain Tumor Society is committed to advancing this really important class of new therapies for our patients. You know, as Dr. Mitchell showed, it's what we're all aiming for is the long-term durable survival, really figuring out which patients will respond to a given therapy. So with that, let me turn it back over to Rachael for questions from our patients, families, and caregivers. Rachael?
Kirk, thank you so much for that. And Dr. Mitchell, thank you so much for such a fantastic presentation for our community. Prior to our recording, we did reach out to our community and ask them to provide for us questions that they would most want to ask you regarding immunotherapy. And the first question that we have actually asks the question, can immunotherapy treatment be applied to all brain tumor types?
That's a great question. And right now, immunotherapy is obviously being explored for development in a variety of brain tumors. And I would say there are several approaches that would be described as platform approaches, meaning that they are potentially applicable to any cancer. One example of that, we've worked on personalized cancer vaccines, where as long as there is tumor tissue, we can use DNA sequencing and RNA sequencing and protein analysis to determine what proteins in that cancer are likely to be attacked by that patient's own immune system, and then make a tailored vaccine for that patient, or a tailored T-cell therapy for that patient. And that can be applied to any cancer that has tumor tissue available that can be analyzed. So the short answer is yes, these approaches, many of them can be applied to any brain tumor. What we understand is there may be certain tumor types that are more likely to respond to certain forms of treatment. And as we're exploring these in clinical trials, we are trying to gain that fundamental understanding of what tumors are most likely to respond to what type of therapy. But many of the approaches are broadly applicable and can be evaluated in a number of different brain tumors.
If I'm a newly diagnosed patient, how do I go about getting that treatment? How do I go about exploring immunotherapy as a possibility for myself or my loved one?
Yeah, it's a really great and important question. And when a patient and family is dealing with a diagnosis of a malignant brain tumor, or really any brain tumor, it's obviously a serious diagnosis, but especially for a malignant brain tumor, there's so much information that's being thrown out at the same time and trying to make important treatment and care decisions. And so I think it's critical that in the midst of what is oftentimes an extraordinarily stressful and overwhelming situation, that a patient or their family members are able to ask their care team whether clinical trials would be available to them or appropriate to look into, and whether their care team can help them evaluate clinical trials that might be relevant. If for whatever reason that if the center is not offering clinical trials for our brain tumor patients at that time, they may want to certainly reach out to societies like the National Brain Tumor Society or others that have patient advocacy groups that can help with that search. I think the earlier you begin to at least consider possible options in the treatment plans, the better. Some clinical trials have what we call enrollment windows. There's a certain time between diagnosis and maybe starting standard treatment where a patient may be eligible. And oftentimes you can just start to have maybe a plan of maybe you're not going to change anything up front right now, but you'd like to know what there may be second line options if that becomes necessary. So the sooner those conversations with both the care team or reaching out for resources, I think advocacy groups and brain tumor societies as an example, to start that search and to gather information, the better.
Yeah, I think I'll just add, I completely agree. I think it's really important to engage your primary care team, hopefully at a good center of excellence. And as Dr. Mitchell said, the National Brain Tumor Society, other patient advocacy groups, we're here for you to help you navigate the landscape, and both in terms of trying to figure out where the clinical trials are available and whether you may be right for it. So the big thing that I keep coming back to is that you try not to be shy. It's really, it's an overwhelming time, but, we're here for you to help you educate and understand the landscape. So please utilize us.
I'll just, quickly jump in with that, which I had not necessarily planned to do. And that is, it's a beautiful lead into our personalized support navigation program, which NBTS does have. And there we have our patient navigator. And so not only is she available to sort of answer those questions, she can also guide a patient and their care partners through our clinical trial finder. And just sort of help them navigate that. It's a pretty user-friendly interface in terms of being able to, put in the information that you're looking for and take a look at clinical trials. And really with the goal of trying to spark that conversation, kind of Kirk, like what you've said, to spark that conversation with your primary care team to say, I talked to this nurse navigator, we looked at clinical trial finder, and I have questions about these things. So certainly at NBTS, it's something that we can provide. I think it's good information, especially for newly diagnosed folks. And kind of piggybacking off of that question, Dr. Mitchell, if I am newly diagnosed and I am looking into that, can you highlight just a couple of questions that someone who is a patient wanting to ask those questions of a provider, what should they be asking? What are some key things that they could bring to that appointment?
So I think with respect to clinical trials information, or whether or not any options other than standard of care treatment would be appropriate or offered, I think that first, I recommend that patients really, and I think Kirk highlighted this earlier, be very vocal or be a strong advocate for your own care, and ask, do you offer, does the center that you're at offer clinical trial options for newly diagnosed patients? There may be scenarios where that's may not be the best consideration, may not be the most appropriate option for a patient based on their own diagnosis, staging. There's a variety of different brain tumors and conditions that may make exploring clinical trials or other treatment options appropriate or not. But understanding whether those are offered, or whether the team is connected to any centers that do offer clinical trial options for patients with brain tumors, I think is something really should be asked early on. Obviously, getting a treatment team, a treatment plan in place with your team is extraordinarily important for the newly diagnosed patient. But for some conditions, some high-grade malignant brain tumors, there are clinical trial options that oftentimes are integrated with standard treatment. So in all of the trials that we are conducting for newly diagnosed, say, patients with glioblastoma, as an example, they are integrated with the surgical resection, radiation, and chemotherapy treatments that are considered a standard of care. And so they're not asked to forego standard treatments in order to participate in the clinical trial. It becomes an option if they would like to integrate that with standard treatment. So I think asking about clinical trials and any options above standard of care is a good question early on in the planning course. And also what the physician and the care team's thoughts are about participating in clinical trials as a brain tumor patient. I'm obviously an advocate for clinical trials. I think it's how we move the field forward. And it also offers some of the more cutting edge approaches that may be of benefit to a patient and family. So I just suggest they ask those right away.
Yeah, I think, being able to add on, the cutting edge things to the standard of care is really critical. And you have to really commend centers and teams like Dr. Mitchell's at the University of Florida, and then other teams and centers across the country that are really conducting these trials where they're really bringing the best care to the patients, but also trying, the patients are really to be committed to, is to understand the biology and understand how these immunotherapies are going to work. And, so again, it's still relatively early days of trying how to crack the nut for getting the immunotherapies to work. But the early data coming in looks promising. And it's now just figuring out with a sense of urgency how we move those to patients in an effective way as efficiently as possible.
Dr. Mitchell, thank you for joining us today, for creating meaningful content for our community, and for answering their questions to help them better understand what immunotherapy is and how it may contribute to providing patients with better outcomes. And Kirk, as always, thank you so much for helping us to break down these complex concepts for our community.
Of course, it really was my pleasure. I really enjoyed it. And again, we're just very thankful for Dr. Mitchell's presentation and discussions.
Well, I just want to thank the National Brain Tumor Society and Rachael and Kirk for this invitation. It's really been a pleasure to speak with you and share this information with your community.
I also want to take a moment to thank our community for joining us to be informed about innovations in immunotherapy and what that means for patients and caregivers. Please join us in the new year as we continue our Informed in 30 series with topics that include Know Your Tumor, your role in research, DNA damage repair, and pediatric brain tumors. Thank you so much for joining us.